So I'm going to focus just a little while longer on my train just a bit, and I want to continue to enhance it by adding some additional elements. And now I still feel a little bit limited when I select my train and I start to play with the different textures that I have access to. The train assets that I downloaded from the Unity Asset Store really gave me a lot of opportunities that I didn't have with some additional textures. But let's say that I took a picture, or I illustrated my own texture, or I found a free texture that I want to implement into my project. There's a number of ways to integrate that content. I have a couple of textures on my desktop. I just have two simple lava textures that I want to integrate into my Unity project. There's two ways that I can do this. The first way is that I could just go through the System Finder. I could go into my project folder, into my assets folder, and I could establish a new folder. I'll just call this textures. And I intentionally created this textures folder outside the standard assets. The train assets, this is the content that I've downloaded from Unity, and now I've just generated my own textures folder. And now I could just drag these assets into my textures folder, and now when I go back to Unity, I'll just collapse my standard assets, I'll collapse my train assets, and now you see that I have a textures folder here. When I select on the textures folder, you can see that I have these individual assets here that I could add to add to my environment. Now, because this content is now within the search path for this project in Unity, when I click on Edit Textures and I add textures, I'll select somewhere in here I should have my lava texture. And I don't see it just by giving it a quick scan. So I know the name of it is going to be based on its file name. And if I want to, I could search this and just type in lava, and I now see that content. This is rendering in alphabetical order, and so once I get down to the L here, I can start to see that here, in fact, is my content, and I'll just double click to load, I'll add, and now I have that texture available as something that I could start to paint inside this environment. And so I mentioned back during a previous presentation that in some cases, some of these textures are just repeating way too often. And it's hard to tell until you actually get in and walk around with your first-person camera. But my gut's telling me that this texture that I just imported is not, it's tiling a little too often. There's too much of a recognizable pattern here for the scale of the geometry that I've created. And so what I might do is just double-click on that texture or choose to edit the texture. And here I can change the size. I can bump this up. I'll just double the X size and I'll double the Y size. And once I do that, I get less of an effect of the repeating pattern. It's a little less obvious here when I look at this. I mean, clearly it's still a repeating texture, but I'm not getting really kind of hit over the head with the fact that this is repeating every, a couple times every, polygon's been generated, or a couple times for every meter that I walk across this island. So at this point, because I'm pretty satisfied with the scale and I want to continue to refine this environment, I might make some decisions about how these textures are repeating and start to influence their size. Now, the size of the texture application is going to have to do with the size of the map and the geometry that you created. And depending on the texture you're using, you might need to choose a different size. So it's not going to be a standard value that you want to apply to all textures. But I can see this texture here. I'm kind of getting the same results, and so maybe I'll just double click on this texture and I'll double this value. And that looks okay. Probably just the same. So anyway, I'm going to continue to play with that. I can import some additional textures. Another way that I can import textures, if I decide that this is that I've established my textures folder, I can always just click, drag, and drop a new texture into an existing folder that I have. I can drag from my desktop or my System Finder, any folder, directly into the Unity interface, and you can see that it actually duplicated that folder and helped manage the file name by incrementing that file name here. So I have two methods of managing the content. I can either drag that content into my project folder, I can build folders on the fly through the System Finder and drag that content in, or I can drag it directly into the project folder. Okay, so if I felt like I needed to have an additional folder in the Assets folder, I might select the Assets folder and either right-click or control-click and choose to create folder. And now I can establish a folder, call it whatever I want, and start to drop content into that folder. I'll just select it and delete it. So that's something to keep in mind as we're generating, finding new assets that we want to organize and manage. So once we get to the point where we're actually modeling content in 3D, or we're finding assets that we want, the 3D assets that we want to incorporate, we want to make sure that we stay organized. So the final thing that I'll talk about when it comes to terrain is, with the terrain selected, we've looked at the raise and lower the terrain height. We've looked at the texture brushes. The brush to the right of the texture brush is the trees, or the place trees brush. And what I'll do is I'll just really quickly add a tree, and that presents me with this add tree dialog box. What I need to do is click on this little bullet next to the tree field, and this will present me with different kinds of trees or foliage that I can actually paint into my scene. So I see that I have access to a palm or a group of palms here. So I'll get started with a couple of palm trees. I'll just double click on the palm. I'll forget about the bend factor right now, but once we start to simulate wind, we can tell the trees to bend according to any wind zones that we might create. But I have a palm tree established. There's the preview now. And just like the texture brushes, I have a brush size that I can establish. I'm going to reduce the brush size here because a little bit goes a long way with these tree brushes. I have the ability to influence the tree density, and I'm just going to bring that down quite a bit. I'm going to forget about the other fields until I get a sense of what I'm actually doing here. So I'm just going to click and paint along my beach here. And you can see that I'm introducing some trees as I do that. And if I bump up the tree density and I start to paint, you can see that I'm creating, you know, tons of trees at a time. And so I have the ability to establish different size trees by influencing the tree height and what kind of variation exists from tree to tree, what the width is, and what the variation in that width is. And so I can just go in and kind of paint in these trees pretty quickly. And once I establish those trees, if I want to get rid of them, just like the terrain brush, if I want to do the opposite of creating or raising or lowering, in this case creating, I'll hold down the Shift key and I'll paint back into what I've just done. So I can just start to populate this environment with trees. If I want to continue to add trees, I can, just like the texture brush, I can add an additional tree. This time I'll go with the palm group. I'll double click, I'll add, and now I have a second asset that I can work with. So I'll take that palm group and I'll start to paint. I'm not seeing anything pop up with that palm group. So that might be something that I don't have access to. Let me try to add another tree here. Let's go with this sycamore. And I'll just pan over here a little bit. Make sure that that sycamore tree is selected, and as I start to paint, you can see that these trees are popping up. So I can populate my environment with trees. In addition to that, I can do things like the next brush over is the paint detail brush. And the paint detail brush allows me to do a couple of different things. Just like adding trees or adding materials, I can edit, and this time I can do one of two things. I can add a grass texture, which is a 2D sprite, or I can add a detail mesh. And the difference between the two is I'll start off by adding a grass texture. And once I add the grass texture, I'm going to find this detail texture. This is a 2D shape. And I'll just go in here and I'll find, let's see, I'll grab this grass texture. I can see in the icon that it's really kind of a billboard graphic. It's a two-dimensional sprite. It's a two-dimensional side view of the grass with a transparency in it. And I'll just double-click to load this. I'll add that grass, and I'll move over a little bit. And what I can do is I can start to paint. Doesn't look like I'm doing anything, but as I zoom in, Okay, so for some reason I couldn't get the grass texture to work, so I went back in and I chose grass 2 texture. So I just went to edit, add grass texture. And instead of using this first grass texture, I chose grass 2. I'm not quite sure why the grass texture wouldn't work, but so I won't let that slow me down. I'll continue to move forward and I'll select this grass 2 texture, and as I click and paint, might take a second for this to render. There it goes. You can see that sometimes it might not look, as I'm painting around, it doesn't look like I'm doing anything, but the level of detail as I zoom in, I'm starting to create some grass. So I'll just kind of continue to paint. My brush is a little big here, so let me bump the brush down, and I'll continue to paint. And as I zoom way in, I can just get in here and paint, and I can start to create some grass. Now, one of the things that I want to warn you about painting these 2D sprites is they look kind of good and kind of interesting, but you pay a potentially huge penalty when it comes to the system resources that you're using to render this content. So I'm just going to grab my first person controller. I'm going to double click on it so I know where it's at. There it is. I'm going to look from a top-down view, and I'm going to take a look at a different part of my island. I'm going to start over here where I just created this grass. And so I'll just drop this roughly about where the grass is, and I'll hit the play button. And so now you can see I'm in this field, an awfully dense field of grass. But if I look and stand, it's kind of waving in the wind. And so as I run around, I can really start to see some of the elements that I created. And as I painted around, I didn't think that I was getting the grass texture, but now that I can see when I'm actually walking around, that I did in fact create a lot more grass than I was getting in my preview. So I think it just wasn't rendering in my preview as I was painting. So I created a lot more information than I intended to, but that's all part of the process. So I'll go back and kind of remove some of this. But so now I have grass, I have trees in the equation, and the final thing that I want to take a look at is, much like the trees and much like the grass, I also have the ability to, with the terrain selected, and using this paint detail, I can edit and add a detail mesh. And what a detail mesh will do is, rather than painting a two-dimensional sprite, just as I've done, I could take something like, in this case, Unity provides a rock mesh. Now, this is just a three-dimensional mesh with a material applied to it. And if I double-click on the rock and I'll just add that, I now have this object that I can go in. Just change my view a little bit here. And I can paint this rock. Into my scene. So I'm trying to paint this rock mesh into my scene, and I see that my preview is not presenting me with the information that I expected to get. There it goes. Okay, so it's way too dense. Let me just hold down the shift key, and the color is kind of strange. It looks like it inherited the grass texture. So I definitely want to take the brush size down. I want to take that opacity way down, and I'll take that target strength down as well, and I'll just get rid of a few of these. So you can see that I'm actually generating a bunch of rocks and painting those onto the side of this hill that I've created. Now, it's inheriting these green textures. If I just go back in and edit this render mode, let me just check that back to grass. It's adopting this healthy and dry color, and that was just a preset that came in with the grass, and I'm not really going to worry about that. I could just adjust this to more of a gray, and you can see that the color is starting to update here. Maybe I'll set it to a white and see what happens here. So there we go. It's looking a little bit more like the rock color. And if I go to vertex lit, it'll start to use the actual lighting in the environment. So it still looks a little dense here, so I'll just kind of get rid of some of the stuff. But you can see how quickly I can populate that environment with these three-dimensional meshes. That's starting to look a little bit better. So I can randomly throw in things like grass and rocks, and I can build my own texture. And as I walk up to these rocks, you can see that some of them are popping into view, and that just has to do with the level of detail. These real-time engines, these game engines are programmed for efficiency, so that as we render this information, or as we run through our game, it's not going to render certain kinds of information way off into the distance. So I don't really need to see these rocks if I'm not up close to them. And you can see I'm getting some artifacts. I can actually get up underneath these rocks, and so their placement isn't exactly the way I want it. But this grass will only render when I get close enough to it to where Unity figures it's a detail that I want to be concerned with. And we have control over setting the level of detail. So things like trees we'll see further off in the distance, but we won't see this kind of grass. So as we back away from it, it'll start to drop out of view, and it will no longer render. So these are some of the things that we can start to play with, that we have access to really start to refine our terrain. So push the terrain forward. You're not going to complete your terrain in one pass or in one day. So make sure that you continue to work on it, walk through it, experience it, ask yourself, what kind of things would improve the wayfinding system that you might want to introduce. Make sure you reference your map along the way and continue to build up your environment. In the next set of presentations, we'll take a look at scripting and start to add some interactivity into our environment and start to focus on some basic game mechanics. So we'll do that in the next presentation.